The rattlesnake struck so fast that Hannah Whitmore barely saw the blur of scales before white-hot pain exploded in her calf, and she stumbled backward into the tall grass as the sun melted into orange fire along the Colorado horizon. She hit the ground hard, her basket of wild herbs scattering across the field. The snake had already disappeared into the underbrush, leaving only the burning agony in her leg and the two perfect puncture wounds that were already beginning to swell. Hannah gasped, her hands trembling as she grabbed at her leg, knowing with terrible certainty what had just happened. She was 3 miles from Fort Collins, alone in the high country meadow where she had come to gather medicinal plants, and darkness was falling fast across the Rocky Mountain foothills. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried to stand, but her leg buckled beneath her. The venom was already working its way through her bloodstream, hot and vicious. She could feel it spreading, a sensation like liquid fire crawling up from the wound. Her vision swam, and she pressed both hands against the bite, as if pressure alone could stop the poison from reaching her heart. The September evening air had been pleasant just moments before, but now she felt cold sweat breaking out across her forehead and neck. "Help!" she tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Who would hear her out here anyway? She had been foolish to wander so far from town alone, but the rare mountain sage only grew in these high meadows, and Mrs. Patterson desperately needed it for her rheumatism. Hannah had thought she would have plenty of time to gather the herbs and return before sunset. She had been wrong. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She knew about snake bites from her years helping Doc Brennan in his office, knew that rattlesnake venom could kill if left untreated, knew that she had perhaps an hour before the poison did irreversible damage. Tears of frustration and fear spilled down her cheeks as she fumbled with her skirt, trying to get a better look at the wound. The punctures were clear and deep, and the flesh around them was already purple and grotesquely swollen. That was when she heard the footsteps, heavy and purposeful, moving through the grass toward her. Hannah's heart leaped with hope and terror in equal measure. Out here in the wilderness, whoever was approaching could be salvation or danger. She had heard too many stories about what happened to women alone in the territories. But she had no choice, no other option except to lie here and die while the venom consumed her. "Please," she managed to say, louder this time, "help me." The man who emerged from the dying light looked like something out of a legend. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sunset behind him. His hair fell past his collar in dark waves, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin pants and a leather vest over a homespun shirt, and his arms were corded with muscle that spoke of years spent surviving in the mountains. A long rifle was slung across his back, and a hunting knife hung at his belt. His eyes, when they found her in the grass, were a startling clear gray, like storm clouds over the peaks. He moved to her side in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her without a word. His gaze went immediately to her leg, to the wound that was now swelling obscenely, the purple discoloration spreading up toward her knee. "Rattlesnake," she gasped. "Just now. Maybe 5 minutes." He did not waste time with questions. His hands were already on her leg, rough and calloused, but surprisingly gentle as he examined the bite. Up close, she could see the sharp intelligence in those gray eyes, the deep tan of his face that came from endless days under the sun, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "My name is Hank Yates," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "And I'm going to help you, but you need to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" Hannah nodded, even though calm was the last thing she felt. Her heart was racing so fast she could hear it pounding in her ears, and the pain in her leg had become excruciating, a throbbing agony that made her want to scream. Hank pulled the knife from his belt, and for one wild moment, Hannah thought he meant to cut her leg off. Instead, he sliced cleanly through the fabric of her dress, exposing the wound more fully. The swelling had progressed even in the few moments since he had arrived, the skin stretched tight and hot to the touch. "This is going to hurt," he said, meeting her eyes, "but it is the only way. I need to get as much of the poison out as possible before it spreads further. Do you understand?" "Yes," Hannah whispered. She had read about this procedure in Doc Brennan's medical books, though she had never seen it performed. The idea of it made her stomach turn, but she knew it was her only chance. Hank positioned himself beside her injured leg, his large hand steadying her calf. "Try not to move," he said. Then he bent his head and put his mouth directly over the puncture wounds. Hannah bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out as she felt the suction, felt him drawing the venom from her flesh. It was intimate in a way that made her face burn despite the circumstances, this stranger's mouth on her bare skin, his strong hands holding her steady. She could feel the muscles in his jaw working as he sucked and spat, over and over again. Each time he drew on the wound, fresh pain lanced through her leg, but she forced herself to remain still, to trust that he knew what he was doing. The sky had turned from orange to deep purple by the time he finally lifted his head. He spat one last time into the grass, his lips stained with her blood, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The wound still looked terrible, but the swelling seemed to have stopped spreading quite so quickly. "That's all I can do for the poison itself," Hank said. His voice was slightly hoarse. "But you are not out of danger yet. The venom is in your system, and your body is going to fight it. That fight is going to take all night, and I'm going to stay right here with you until it is over." "You don't have to," Hannah started to say, but he cut her off with a look. "Yes, I do," he said simply. "You will not survive the night alone out here, and I will not leave you to die in a field when I can prevent it." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a quiet authority that made it clear this was not up for discussion. Hannah found she did not have the strength to protest anyway. The adrenaline that had been keeping her alert was fading, and in its place came a bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping nausea that made her head spin. Hank moved with swift efficiency, gathering her scattered herbs and using the basket to collect dry grass and small branches. Within minutes, he had a fire burning, its warmth pushing back the chill of the mountain night. Then he shrugged out of his vest and rolled it into a pillow, positioning it gently under her head. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked. "Hannah," she managed. "Hannah Whitmore. I live in Fort Collins. I was just gathering herbs." "Well, Hannah Whitmore, you picked a dangerous spot for your gathering," Hank said, but there was no judgment in his voice, only a kind of gruff concern. "These meadows are full of rattlers this time of year. They like the warm rocks when the sun goes down." "I know," Hannah said miserably. "I should have been more careful. I should have watched where I was stepping." "Should have does not matter now," Hank replied. "All that matters is getting you through this night." He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame, and pulled a canteen from his pack. He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her shoulders with one muscular arm while he held the canteen to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "Your stomach is going to be upset from the venom." The water was cool and clean, tasting of mountain streams. Hannah drank gratefully, though he was right about her stomach. The nausea was getting worse, rolling through her in waves that made her break out in fresh sweats. As full darkness settled over the meadow, Hannah's condition deteriorated. The pain in her leg intensified to the point where she could not hold back small whimpers, and her whole body began to shake with alternating chills and fevers. Hank stayed beside her through all of it, his presence steady and calm. When she was cold, he built up the fire and wrapped his own wool blanket around her shoulders. When she was hot, he dampened a cloth with water from his canteen and placed it on her forehead. When the pain became unbearable, he held her hand, his grip strong and sure, anchoring her to consciousness. "Talk to me," he said during one of her more lucid moments. "Tell me about yourself. It will help keep your mind off the pain." Hannah's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak, but she forced the words out. "I am 22. I have lived in Fort Collins for 5 years, since my parents died of cholera. I work with Doc Brennan, helping him with his patients. I mix medicines and dress wounds and deliver babies." "A healer," Hank said approvingly. "That's good work." "What about you?" Hannah asked, desperate for distraction from the agony that was consuming her entire leg now, creeping up into her hip and lower back. "Where do you come from?" "Everywhere and nowhere," Hank said. He was cleaning the wound again, and Hannah gasped as fresh pain shot through her. "I have been in these mountains for 8 years. Before that, I was a tracker for the Army. Before that, I grew up in Tennessee, but there was nothing left for me there after the war." "The war," Hannah repeated. The Civil War had ended in 1865, 16 years ago now in this autumn of 1881, but its scars still ran deep across the nation. You fought? I did, Hank said quietly. But I do not talk about that. Not anymore. There was a darkness in his voice that made Hannah wish she had not asked. She understood about not wanting to revisit painful memories. She had plenty of her own. The night dragged on with agonizing slowness. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes delirious. In her fevered state, she saw her parents' faces, heard their voices calling to her. She saw the snake again and again, striking in an endless loop. She felt like she was burning from the inside out, like the venom had turned her blood to fire. Through it all, Hank remained beside her. His voice was a constant, low and soothing, talking to her about the mountains, about the elk herds and the way the aspens turned gold in the fall, about the crystal-clear lakes hidden in the high country. His hand stayed clasped around hers, and she clung to it like a lifeline, like it was the only real thing in a world that had become nothing but pain and confusion. At some point deep in the night, her fever spiked so high that she began to convulse. Hank moved swiftly, turning her on her side so she would not choke, holding her steady as her body shook uncontrollably. When the seizure passed, she lay gasping and weak, tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry," she sobbed. "I am sorry you have to see me like this." "Hush," Hank said firmly. His hand was on her hair now, smoothing it back from her damp forehead with surprising tenderness. "You have nothing to apologize for. You're fighting for your life, and you're doing it with more courage than most men I have known. You're going to survive this, Hannah. I promise you that." His certainty gave her strength. She focused on his face in the firelight, on the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the steady gray of his eyes. He looked like something carved from the mountains themselves, solid and immovable and utterly dependable. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Hank said simply. "And because no one should die alone in the dark when they could be saved." There was a story there, Hannah thought, some deep hurt that drove him to sit vigil over a stranger. But she did not have the strength to ask, and he did not volunteer anything more. As the hours crept toward dawn, Hannah felt a subtle shift in her body. The pain was still there, still intense, but it had changed quality somehow, becoming more bearable. The nausea began to recede, and her temperature started to stabilize. She could think more clearly, could focus on Hank's face without it swimming in and out of her vision. "The worst is passing," Hank said, and she heard relief in his voice. "You are through the crisis." "How do you know?" Hannah asked. Her voice was hoarse from hours of fever and pain. "I have seen enough snake bites to recognize the signs," Hank replied. "The venom is running its course. Your body is winning the fight." Fresh tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than pain. "Thank you," she said. "You saved my life." "You saved yourself," Hank corrected. "You stayed strong through the worst of it. I just made sure you were not alone." But they both knew that was not entirely true. Without his quick action in drawing out the venom, without his care through the long night, she would almost certainly have died in this meadow. She owed him everything. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep blue to pale gray. Hannah could make out the shapes of the mountains now, the tall grass bending in the pre-dawn breeze, the last stars fading overhead. She had never been so grateful to see a sunrise. Hank helped her sit up slowly, supporting her weight when her weakened body threatened to collapse. The movement made her head swim, but she forced herself to remain upright. Her leg was still grotesquely swollen and discolored, but the angry purple had faded to a mottled bruising, and the heat of infection had not set in. "Can you stand?" Hank asked. Hannah tried, but her injured leg would not support her weight. She would have fallen if Hank had not caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist and steadying her against his chest. She found herself pressed against the solid wall of his torso, feeling the powerful muscles beneath his shirt, the steady beat of his heart. He smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something else, something clean and masculine that made her acutely aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. "I will carry you," Hank said. Before she could protest, he had swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. One arm supported her shoulders and the other was under her knees, cradling her against his broad chest. "It is 3 miles to Fort Collins," Hannah said weakly. "You cannot carry me that far." "Watch me," Hank replied, and started walking. He moved through the meadow with long, steady strides, his breathing not even labored despite her weight in his arms. Hannah had no choice but to wrap her arms around his neck and hold on, her head resting against his shoulder. She could feel the flex and bunch of his muscles as he walked, could sense the raw physical power in him. He was built like someone who had spent years doing hard labor in unforgiving country, all lean strength and endurance. The sun rose as they descended from the high meadow, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Hank did not stop or slow, did not complain or show any sign of tiring. He just kept walking, carrying her as easily as he might carry a child. "Tell me about yourself," Hannah said after a while. She wanted to know more about this mysterious man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. "You said you have been in the mountains for 8 years. What do you do up there?" "I trap mostly," Hank said. "Beaver, fox, marten. I sell the pelts in Fort Collins and the other towns. Sometimes I guide hunting parties or lead pack trains. Whatever work I can find." "Do you live up there year-round?" Hannah asked. She could not imagine surviving a Colorado winter in the high country. "I have a cabin near Horsetooth Rock," Hank said. "It is small but solid, and it keeps the weather out. I come down to Fort Collins for supplies every few weeks." "I have lived there for 5 years, and I have never seen you," Hannah said. "I do not spend much time in town," Hank replied. "I'm not really a town kind of man. Too many people, too much noise. The mountains suit me better." Hannah could understand that. There was something about him that seemed too big for civilization, too wild and untamed for the confines of streets and buildings. He belonged in these open spaces under the wide sky. They talked as he walked, Hank sharing stories of his life in the wilderness, and Hannah telling him about her work with Doc Brennan. She learned that he was 30 years old, that he had no family left, that he had chosen solitude after too many years of violence and loss. She told him about her parents, about how she had nearly starved before Doc Brennan took her in and taught her his trade, about her small room above the general store and her hopes of one day having her own apothecary. By the time Fort Collins came into view, Hannah felt like she had known Hank Yates for years rather than hours. There was an ease between them, a comfortable connection that seemed to transcend their brief acquaintance. She found herself reluctant for this strange journey to end, reluctant to let go of him and return to her ordinary life. Fort Collins was just beginning to wake as they arrived. A few early risers stared in shock at the sight of the massive mountain man carrying Hannah Whitmore through the streets, but Hank ignored them completely. He went straight to Doc Brennan's office and kicked the door with his boot until the elderly doctor appeared, his gray hair standing on end and his spectacles askew. "Good Lord, Hannah," Doc Brennan exclaimed. "What happened?" "Rattlesnake bite," Hank said curtly. "Last night in the high meadow. I drew out what poison I could and sat with her through the worst of it, but she needs proper medical attention now." Doc Brennan ushered them inside immediately, clearing the examination table with a sweep of his arm. Hank laid Hannah down gently, his hands lingering for just a moment before he stepped back. The doctor examined her leg with practiced efficiency, his face grave. "You did good work," he said to Hank. "Another hour and the venom would have reached her heart. You saved her life." "She's strong," Hank said. "She did most of the saving herself." Doc Brennan prepared a poultice for the wound and gave Hannah laudanum for the pain. As the medication began to take effect, making her drowsy and foggy, she reached out and caught Hank's hand. "Do not leave," she said. "Please, I want to see you again." Hank looked down at her, his gray eyes unreadable. For a long moment he did not respond, and Hannah felt her heart sink. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "I will come back," he said. "I promise." Those were the last words Hannah heard before the laudanum pulled her under into dreamless sleep. She woke late in the afternoon to find herself in her own bed above the general store. Doc Brennan sat in a chair beside her, reading a medical journal by the light of the window. "Welcome back," he said when he saw her eyes open. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a horse," Hannah admitted. Her leg throbbed with every heartbeat and her whole body ached. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. "You are lucky to be feeling anything at all," Doc Brennan said sternly. "That was incredibly foolish, going so far from town alone. You could have died out there." "I know," Hannah said. "Where is he? Where is Hank?" "The mountain man?" Doc Brennan shook his head. He left after I took over your care this morning. Said he had things to attend to. Disappointment flooded through Hannah. She had hoped he would stay, hoped to see him when she woke. But perhaps that had been foolish. He had done his duty by saving her and delivering her safely to the doctor. He had no obligation to linger. Did he say when he would come back? She asked, hating how small and hopeful her voice sounded. He did not, Doc Brennan replied, but he struck me as a man of his word. If he said he would return, I expect he will. Over the next week, Hannah recovered slowly. The swelling in her leg went down, though the bite marks themselves remained angry and red. Doc Brennan changed her bandages daily and gave her willow bark tea for the pain. Mrs. Patterson from down the street brought her soup and fresh bread. The other townspeople stopped by to wish her well and hear the dramatic story of her rescue. But Hank Yates did not come. Hannah tried not to let it bother her, tried to focus on her recovery and getting back to her work helping Doc Brennan. But every time the office door opened, her heart would leap with hope, only to sink when it was someone else. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she barely knew the man, that there was no reason for him to take time out of his solitary life to visit her. And yet she could not stop thinking about him. She remembered the feel of his strong arms carrying her down the mountain, the gentle way he had tended to her through her fever, the steadiness of his presence through the worst night of her life. She remembered his voice in the darkness, anchoring her to the world, and the way his hand had felt wrapped around hers. 2 weeks after the snake bite, Hannah was finally able to walk again with only a slight limp. She was helping Doc Brennan prepare medications in the office when the door opened, and a familiar massive frame filled the doorway. Hank Yates looked exactly as she remembered, all broad shoulders and muscled arms, his long dark hair pulled back from his face. He carried a burlap sack in one hand and wore the same buckskin and leather that seemed to be his uniform. His gray eyes found her immediately, and something in them made Hannah's breath catch in her throat. "I told you I would come back," he said. Hannah felt a smile spread across her face, wide and genuine and completely unbidden. "You did." Hank crossed the room in 3 long strides and set the sack on the counter. "I brought you something," he said, "for your medicines." Hannah opened the sack and found it full of mountain sage, more than she could have gathered in a month of searching. The plants were carefully harvested, roots and all, still fresh and green. "Oh," she breathed, "this is wonderful. This is exactly what I needed. How did you know?" "You said you were gathering herbs when the snake bit you," Hank replied. "I figured you still needed them, and I know where the sage grows." It was such a thoughtful gesture, so practical and yet so personal, that Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "This means more than you know." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with something Hannah could not quite name. Then Doc Brennan cleared his throat deliberately, reminding them of his presence. "I should check your leg," Hank said abruptly, "to see how it is healing." Hannah blinked in surprise but nodded. She sat in one of the office chairs and hiked up her skirt enough to show the bite, which had healed to a pair of shiny pink scars surrounded by fading bruises. Hank knelt before her and examined it with surprising gentleness, his large hands careful on her skin. "It healed well," he said. "No infection. Doc Brennan did good work." "So did you," Hannah replied softly. "I would not be here without you." Hank stood, but he did not move away. He looked down at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked. "There is a lot I would like to talk to you about." "Yes," Hannah said without hesitation. "I would like that very much." They met that evening at the small restaurant on Main Street. Hank looked uncomfortable in the confines of the building, his large frame seeming too big for the delicate furniture, but his eyes never left Hannah's face. They ate roast chicken and potatoes while Hannah told him about her recovery and the grateful patients she had been able to help with the mountain sage he brought her. "I have been thinking about you," Hank said suddenly, setting down his fork. "Every day since I left you with the doctor. I tried to stay away, tried to tell myself it was better not to come back. But I could not stop thinking about you." Hannah's heart was hammering in her chest. "Why would it be better not to come back?" "Because I am not a good prospect for a woman like you," Hank said bluntly. "I live in a cabin in the mountains. I have nothing to offer but a hard life and uncertain income. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone settled, someone respectable, someone who can give you a proper home in town." What if I do not want those things? Hannah asked. Her voice was trembling but determined. What if what I want is someone honest and kind and brave? What if I want someone who would sit with me through the worst night of my life and never once make me feel like I was a burden? Hank stared at her, something fierce and vulnerable flashing across his face. Hannah. I have been thinking about you too, Hannah said. I have not been able to stop. I know it is crazy. I barely know you. But I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for someone like you to walk into it. I am not an easy man, Hank warned. I have seen and done things that left marks. I am more comfortable with silence than conversation. I am rough around the edges and set in my ways. I do not need easy, Hannah replied. I need real, and you are the realest person I have ever met. Hank reached across the table and took her hand in his much larger one, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The touch sent electricity racing up Hannah's arm, the same sensation she had felt when he held her hand through her fever. I want to court you properly, Hank said. If you will have me, I want to do this right. Yes, Hannah said, smiling through sudden tears. Yes, I will have you. Over the next months, Hank came down from the mountains every week to see Hannah. They took long walks along the Cache La Poudre River, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He told her more about his past, about growing up in Tennessee and fighting in the war, about the things he had seen and done that haunted him still. She told him about her dreams for the future, about wanting to help people and make a difference in the world. Hank was not a man given to flowery words or grand romantic gestures. His love showed itself in quieter ways, in the venison he brought her to make sure she was eating well, in the way he repaired the loose boards on the steps to her room without being asked, in the mountain flowers he picked for her because he remembered her saying she thought them beautiful. He was protective without being overbearing, supportive without trying to control her, and utterly devoted in a way that made Hannah feel cherished and valued. For her part, Hannah discovered that she loved everything about him. She loved his quiet strength, the way he could sit in comfortable silence or engage in deep conversation with equal ease. She loved watching him move, all that leashed power and unconscious grace. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and rare. She loved how safe she felt with him, how completely she trusted him. The townspeople of Fort Collins had mixed reactions to their courtship. Some thought it romantic, the town healer and the mountain man. Others worried that Hannah was throwing away her future on a rough frontiersman. Doc Brennan remained neutral, saying only that Hannah was old enough to make her own choices, and that Hank Yates seemed like a decent man, which was high praise coming from the usually skeptical doctor. Winter came to Colorado in full force, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold. Hank's visits became less frequent as the mountain passes grew treacherous, but he still made the journey down to Fort Collins whenever he could. On one particularly brutal January day, he arrived half frozen, his beard white with ice and his hands numb despite his heavy gloves. Hannah immediately pulled him into the office and sat him by the stove, bringing him hot coffee and blankets. "You should not have come in this weather," she scolded, even as her heart swelled with the knowledge that he had braved the storm to see her. "I had to see you," Hank said simply. His eyes, those clear gray eyes she had come to love, held hers steadily. "Hannah, I cannot keep living in the mountains and leaving you here in town. I cannot keep spending weeks at a time away from you. It is driving me mad." "What are you saying?" Hannah asked, her pulse quickening. Hank set down his coffee and took both her hands in his. "I am saying that I want you to be my wife. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. I know I am not the man most women would choose. I know I cannot offer you luxury or comfort, but I can offer you my whole heart, Hannah. Everything I am, everything I have, it is yours if you will take it." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make, and the raw emotion in his voice made tears stream down her face. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, Hank Yates. I do not need luxury or comfort. I just need you." Hank pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, he kissed her. His lips were cold from the winter wind, but they warmed quickly against hers, the kiss deep and hungry and full of months of restrained passion. Hannah melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since that night in the meadow, when you fought so hard to survive. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known." "I love you too," Hannah whispered. "You are my everything." They were married in March of 1882, when the snow had melted enough for travel and the first wildflowers were beginning to appear in the high meadows. The ceremony was small, held in the Fort Collins church with Doc Brennan giving Hannah away and a few of Hank's fellow trappers standing up as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Hank had trimmed his beard and combed his long hair back, looking almost civilized, though no less massive and powerful. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hank kissed her with a tenderness that made the small congregation sigh. Hannah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This strong, silent man was hers now, and she was his, bound together for the rest of their lives. The question of where they would live had been resolved in a series of long conversations over the winter. Hank had offered to find work in Fort Collins and live in town if that was what Hannah wanted, but she had surprised him by saying she wanted to try life in the mountains. She had always felt confined by the town, had always longed for more space and freedom. The idea of living in the wilderness with Hank, of building a life together in that wild and beautiful country, appealed to her deeply. Doc Brennan had been sad to lose his assistant, but understanding. "You have to follow your heart," he had told her, "and yours clearly lies with that mountain man of yours. Just promise me you will come back to visit occasionally and help out when I need an extra pair of hands." Hannah had promised readily. She would miss Doc Brennan and the work they did together, but she knew this was the right choice. Her life was with Hank now, wherever that led. After the wedding, they packed up Hannah's few belongings and made the journey up to Hank's cabin. It took most of the day, following narrow trails through the foothills and into the higher elevations. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a view of Horsetooth Rock and the mountains beyond. It was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace and a loft for sleeping, but it was solidly built and snug. "Hey, it is not much," Hank said as he helped Hannah down from the horse, suddenly seeming uncertain. "But I can add on to it. I can make it bigger, more comfortable." "It is perfect," Hannah said honestly. The cabin felt cozy and safe, and everywhere she looked she saw evidence of Hank in the carefully chinked logs, the neat stacks of firewood, the well-maintained tools. It is home. That first night as husband and wife, Hank carried Hannah up the ladder to the loft and laid her gently on the bed he had built with his own hands. He made love to her with the same careful intensity he brought to everything, learning her body with patient attention, making sure she felt nothing but pleasure. Hannah had been nervous, but Hank was so gentle, so attuned to her responses, that nervousness gave way to wonder, and then to passion that matched his own. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the small window, Hannah traced the scars on Hank's chest and arms, evidence of his hard life. He caught her hand and kissed her fingers. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "A wife, a home, someone to love. After the war, I thought I was too broken for it, too damaged." "You are not broken," Hannah said fiercely. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived things that would have destroyed lesser men, and you kept your humanity and your kindness. That is not broken, Hank. That is extraordinary." He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "I will spend every day trying to make you happy," he promised. "Every single day for the rest of our lives." "You already make me happy," Hannah assured him, "just by being you." The first months of married life were an adjustment for both of them. Hannah had to learn the rhythms of mountain living, the practical skills needed to survive in the wilderness. Hank taught her how to fish in the cold streams, how to identify edible plants, how to read the signs of changing weather in the sky and the behavior of animals. She learned how to preserve meat and cure hides, how to make soap and candles, how to keep the cabin warm through the cold nights. In turn, Hannah brought her own skills to their partnership. She established a garden near the cabin where she grew vegetables and medicinal herbs. She used her knowledge from working with Doc Brennan to treat the minor injuries and illnesses that were common in such a remote location. When Hank's trapper friends stopped by, she tended to their various ailments and soon gained a reputation as a skilled healer. They fell into a comfortable routine. Hank would check his trap lines and hunt while Hannah tended the garden and the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Hank carving or repairing equipment while Hannah sewed or prepared medicines. They talked about their days, made plans for the future, or simply enjoyed the peaceful silence of being together. True to her promise, Hannah made the journey down to Fort Collins every few weeks to help Doc Brennan and visit with the townspeople. Hank usually accompanied her, though he never stayed in town longer than necessary. He was a creature of the mountains, and the confines of civilization made him restless. Their first summer together was a time of deep contentment. They explored the high country together, Hank showing Hannah hidden meadows and pristine alpine lakes that few people ever saw. They picked wild berries and caught trout in crystal-clear streams. They made love under the stars and woke to spectacular sunrises, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Hannah had never been happier. Every day with Hank felt like a gift, every moment together precious. She loved the life they were building, loved the independence and freedom of the mountains, loved coming home to their cabin and knowing that this strong, wonderful man was hers. In the fall, Hannah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited until she was certain before telling Hank. She broke the news one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a long moment, Hank just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile Hannah had ever seen, transforming his usually serious features into something young and joyful. "A baby?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby?" "Yes," Hannah confirmed, laughing at his obvious delight. "In the spring, around April or May." Hank swept her up in his arms, spinning her around before setting her down carefully, as if she might break. "This is the best news," he said. "The absolute best news. I'm going to be a father." "You're going to be a wonderful father," Hannah assured him. She could already picture it, this big, strong man cradling a tiny infant with infinite gentleness. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into the winter. Hank became even more protective than usual, insisting on doing all the heavy work around the cabin and fussing over Hannah constantly. She found it endearing even when it was slightly annoying, knowing it came from a place of deep love and concern. As winter deepened and the snow piled high around the cabin, they spent long evenings planning for the baby's arrival. Hank built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, carving it with loving attention to detail. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling with anticipation every time she thought about the child growing inside her. When the first signs of spring appeared in late March, Hannah knew the baby would come soon. She had been having irregular contractions for days, her body preparing for the work ahead. Hank made the journey down to Fort Collins to fetch Doc Brennan, and the elderly doctor agreed to stay at the cabin until the birth. The labor began in earnest on a bright April morning. Hannah had attended enough births to know what to expect, but experiencing it herself was entirely different. The pain was intense, wave after wave of contractions that left her gasping and sweating. But Hank never left her side, holding her hand, supporting her weight when she needed to walk, speaking to her in that low, steady voice that had anchored her through the snake bite so long ago. After 12 hours of hard labor, Hannah finally delivered a healthy baby boy. Doc Brennan placed the squalling infant on her chest, and Hannah looked down at her son in wonder. He had a shock of dark hair and looked absolutely furious about being born, his tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out with one massive finger to stroke the baby's tiny hand, and the infant immediately grasped it, holding on tight. The sight of her strong mountain man being completely undone by this tiny person made Hannah's eyes fill with tears. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on one. Now, looking at her husband holding their son with such gentle reverence, Hannah knew exactly what to call him. "Hunter," she said. "Hunter Yates, for a boy who will grow up strong in these mountains." "Hunter," Hank repeated, testing the name. A smile spread across his face. "I like it. Hunter Yates. Welcome to the world, son." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Hunter was a healthy baby with strong lungs and an appetite that kept Hannah constantly nursing. Hank proved to be a devoted father, pacing the cabin floor with Hunter when he fussed, changing his diapers without complaint, and staring at his son with an expression of absolute wonder on his face. Hannah watched her husband with their child and fell even more deeply in love with him. Seeing this powerful man reduced to gentle tenderness by a tiny baby, hearing him sing old mountain songs in his rumbling voice to soothe Hunter to sleep, observing the fierce protectiveness in his eyes whenever he looked at his son. All of it made Hannah grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. As Hunter grew from an infant to a toddler, the cabin became filled with new life and energy. The boy had his father's gray eyes and his mother's quick smile, and he was fearless in the way of young children wanting to explore everything. Hank built a fence around the cabin to keep Hunter safe, and Hannah found herself constantly chasing after her adventurous son. 2 years after Hunter's birth, Hannah became pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter in the early winter, a tiny girl with Hannah's blue eyes and delicate features. They named her Hope because she represented all the promise and potential of the future they were building together. With 2 young children, the cabin was definitely getting crowded. True to his word, Hank spent that winter and spring adding onto the structure, creating a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living space. He worked tirelessly, and Hannah could see the pride he took in providing a good home for his family. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Hunter grew tall and strong, following his father around and learning the ways of the mountains. Hope proved to be as adventurous as her brother, keeping up with him despite being smaller. Hannah continued her healing work, gaining a reputation throughout the region as someone who could cure ailments and deliver babies with skill and compassion. Hank's trapping business prospered, and they were able to save money and improve their homestead. When Hunter was 7 and Hope was 5, Hannah gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Henry and Harrison. The cabin was chaos for a while, with 4 young children demanding attention, but it was joyful chaos. Hank proved to have endless patience, and Hannah marveled at how their once solitary mountain man had become the center of a lively, loving family. Through it all, the love between Hannah and Hank only deepened. They still made time for each other, stolen moments after the children were asleep when they could simply be husband and wife rather than mother and father. Hank would hold her close and tell her she was beautiful, even after 4 pregnancies had changed her body. Hannah would trace the new lines on his face and the gray appearing in his hair and love him more than ever. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters when food was scarce, illnesses that frightened them, injuries from the dangerous work of mountain living. But they faced everything together, their partnership strong and unshakable. One evening, after the children were all asleep, Hannah and Hank sat together on the porch of their expanded cabin, looking out at the stars scattered across the dark sky. It had been 12 years since that fateful day when the snake had bitten her in the meadow. "Do you ever regret it?" Hank asked quietly. "Giving up your life in town for this?" Hannah turned to look at her husband, at the strong, weathered face she loved so well. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "This life, this family, it is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I think about that night sometimes," Hank said. "The night I found you in the field. If I had gone a different way, if I had been even a few minutes later, I would never have met you. We would not have any of this." "But you did find me," Hannah said, taking his hand. "You saved my life, and then you gave me this beautiful life to live. I thank God for that snake bite every single day because it brought you to me." Hank pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Hannah Yates, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Hannah said. "Always." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved. It was not the life Hannah had imagined for herself all those years ago, but it was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing of their children. Hunter grew into a young man who was the image of his father, tall and powerfully built with the same quiet strength and steady gray eyes. He proved to be a natural tracker and hunter, and Hank taught him everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness. Hope developed her mother's gift for healing and spent hours learning about medicinal plants and their properties. She had a gentle way with people that made even the most reluctant patients trust her. By the time she was 15, she was assisting Hannah with complex medical cases and difficult births. The twins, Henry and Harrison, were inseparable and full of mischief. They kept the household lively with their schemes and adventures, though they also showed signs of their parents' best qualities, their father's courage, and their mother's compassion. When Hannah was 38 and Hank was 46, they welcomed their last child, another daughter they named Grace. She was a surprise, born 14 years after the twins, but no less beloved for being unexpected. The older children doted on their baby sister, and Grace grew up surrounded by love and laughter. As the children grew older and began to make their own ways in the world, Hannah and Hank found themselves with more time alone together. Hunter married a girl from Fort Collins and started his own homestead not far from his parents. Hope decided to study medicine more formally, making arrangements to work with doctors in Denver while still returning home frequently. The twins showed interest in following their father into the trapping and guiding business. Through all the changes, the cabin in the mountains remained a place of warmth and welcome. Hannah and Hank's children brought their own children to visit, and the sound of grandchildren's laughter filled the spaces that had once been occupied by their own kids. Hannah continued her healing work well into her later years, her reputation as a skilled healer spreading throughout Colorado. Hank remained strong and vital despite the gray in his hair and beard, still able to trek through the mountains and work his trap lines, though he did so less frequently as the years passed. On the 20th anniversary of their meeting, Hank took Hannah back to the meadow where the snake had bitten her. It was a warm September evening, the same time of year as that fateful day. They stood together in the tall grass, now both older, but still very much in love. "I remember exactly where you were lying," Hank said, pointing to a spot near a large boulder. "I remember how scared I was that I would not be able to save you." "But you did save me," Hannah said. "In every way, a person can be saved." Hank turned to her and took both her hands in his, the way he had done when he proposed all those years ago. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before I met you, not really living. You gave me purpose and love and a family I never thought I would have. You made my life worth living." Hannah felt tears on her cheeks, the good kind that came from overwhelming happiness. "We saved each other then. We made each other whole." They stood together in the meadow as the sun set, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and pink as it had that long ago evening. But this time, instead of pain and fear, there was only peace and contentment and the deep, abiding love of two people who had found each other against all odds. As they walked back to their cabin hand in hand, Hannah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A snake bite that should have killed her had instead led her to the love of her life. A night of pain and fear had blossomed into decades of joy and partnership. A chance encounter in a meadow had changed everything. "What are you thinking about?" Hank asked, attuned to her as always. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am," Hannah said, "for that snake, for that night, for you finding me when you did. I'm grateful for every moment we have had together." "Even the hard ones?" Hank asked with a slight smile. "Especially the hard ones," Hannah confirmed, "because we faced them together and they made us stronger. Every challenge, every struggle, every moment of fear or doubt, they all brought us here, to this life we built. I would not change a single thing." "Neither would I," Hank agreed. He stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You are my everything, Hannah. You always have been from that first night. You always will be." They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who had beaten the odds and built something beautiful together, standing in the fading light of a Colorado evening. Then they continued home, to the cabin that held their life and their memories, ready to face whatever came next side by side. The years that followed were gentler, marked by the quieter joys of grandparenthood and the comfort of a long marriage well lived. Hannah's healing work became more advisory as her body slowed down, but her mind remained sharp, and her knowledge was sought after by younger healers. Hank spent more time around the cabin, tending the expanded homestead and teaching his grandchildren the skills he had once taught their parents. When Grace married at 22, settling nearby with a young carpenter who reminded Hannah a bit of a younger Hank, all of their children were established in good lives. The cabin became a gathering place for the whole family, especially during holidays and celebrations. Hannah was 55, and Hank was 63 when they finally decided to take a trip. They had long talked about returning to Tennessee, so Hank could show her where he grew up. It was a journey filled with bittersweet memories for Hank, seeing the places of his childhood and youth, but having Hannah by his side made it bearable. They returned to Colorado more grateful than ever for the life they had built in the mountains. The trip had been enlightening, but it had also confirmed what they both already knew: home was not a place they had left behind, but the life they had created together. As they moved into their 60s and 70s, Hannah and Hank's love remained as strong as ever. They were rarely apart, still holding hands when they walked, still stealing kisses when they thought no one was watching, still looking at each other with the same warmth and affection they had felt as newlyweds. Their children often remarked on how lucky they were to have such an example of lasting love. Hannah would smile and say that it was not luck but choice, the choice to love each other every day, through good times and bad, through challenges and triumphs. Hank would add that finding the right person made all the difference, and he had found his right person lying in a meadow after a snake bite all those years ago. On a clear October evening when Hannah was 67 and Hank was 75, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The mountains were dressed in their autumn colors, the aspens glowing gold in the slanting sunlight. Their family was gathered inside the cabin for Sunday dinner, multiple generations filling the space with noise and life and love. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Hannah asked, "when I was so scared and in so much pain?" "I told you that you were going to survive," Hank said. "I promised you that." "You did," Hannah confirmed, "and you kept that promise. But you gave me so much more than just survival. You gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You gave me love and family and purpose and joy. You gave me everything." Hank's eyes, still that clear gray despite his age, held hers with the same intensity they always had. "You gave me the same, Hannah. Before you, I was just a man alone in the mountains. You made me whole. You made me better. You made every day worth living." Inside the cabin, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, the sound of dishes clattering, Hope's voice raised in some story that had everyone's attention. This was their legacy, not just children and grandchildren, but the love that had created this family, the devotion that had sustained it through decades of life in the challenging but beautiful Colorado wilderness. "I would do it all again," Hannah said. "Every single moment. I would let that snake bite me 1,000 times if it meant finding you." "And I would always find you," Hank replied. "In this life or any other. You are my heart, Hannah Yates. You always will be." They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, hand in hand, their lives intertwined so completely that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. From a chance encounter in a field at dusk to a love that had lasted over 4 decades, theirs was a story of survival and devotion, of two souls finding each other in the vast wilderness and choosing to build something beautiful together. The snakebite that should have ended Hannah's life had instead begun it in the truest sense. It had brought her Hank, and Hank had brought her everything else: a home in the mountains, a family that sprawled across generations, a partnership that had weathered every storm, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the Colorado sky, Hannah leaned her head on Hank's broad shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. This was where she belonged, where she had always belonged, in the arms of the mountain man who had saved her life and then spent the rest of his own, making sure that life was filled with love. Inside the cabin, someone called for them to come in for dessert. Hank stood and offered Hannah his hand, pulling her gently to her feet. They walked inside together, into the warmth and light and laughter, into the life they had built from a moment of crisis in a darkening meadow so many years ago. And if Hannah sometimes looked at the faded scars on her leg and felt a surge of gratitude for the snake that had bitten her on that long-ago September evening, well, that was a secret she and Hank shared. Because that bite had been the beginning of everything, the pain that led to love, the poison that led to healing, the near death that led to the most vibrant, beautiful life either of them could have imagined. Their story was told and retold through the years, becoming a family legend passed down through generations. The tale of how a mountain man named Hank Yates had saved a young healer named Hannah Whitmore from a rattlesnake bite, sitting with her through the worst night of her life, and how that single act of compassion had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime. When Hank finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, surrounded by his family in the cabin he had built with his own hands, Hannah held his hand one last time and thanked him for every moment they had shared. She lived for another 3 years, kept going by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them products of the love she and Hank had shared. On the day Hannah died at 70, sitting in the rocking chair Hank had made for her on the porch of their mountain cabin, her last words were about that night in the meadow. "He saved me," she told Hope, who was holding her hand, "and then he loved me for the rest of my life. I could not have asked for anything more." She was buried next to Hank on a hillside overlooking the meadow where they had met, where a snake's bite had set in motion a love story for the ages. Their graves were marked with simple stones, but the true monument to their love was the family they had created, the lives they had touched, and the example they had set of what it meant to love someone completely and unconditionally. The cabin still stands, maintained by their descendants, a testament to the mountain man and the healer who built a life together in the Colorado wilderness. And sometimes, on warm September evenings, when the sun sets in shades of orange and gold, you can almost see two figures standing hand in hand in the meadow, remembering the night that changed everything, grateful for the poison that led to love, thankful for the darkness that led to light, and most of all, blessed by the chance encounter that brought two souls together against all odds and kept them together for a lifetime of devotion and joy.